When the desert went dark, a generator sputtered and died inside a windowless room filled with humming racks and temperature gauges. The emergency lights blinked twice, and then nothing. No cold breath of the air conditioning, no chatter of the monitoring consoles, just the hush that comes the moment power fails and the things you thought were secured realize they are not. Dust lifted in a slow cloud where the vents stilled. In the confusion, someone pulled a sheet back from a stack of metal cases that had sat locked in a clamp-controlled vault for decades. A fat file binder fell open. A tape canister, label half peeled, rolled into the gutter. The systems that kept secrets tidy and behind glass were suddenly inconveniently fragile. I found out about that failure weeks later when a contact sent me an image of a stamped folder. Jaguar 6, Patrol Attachment. The top line was redacted in a way that tells you more than the black ink does. It was one thing to be silenced in the field. It is another to have your words disappear into a cabinet while someone else decides what language will exist in the world. My name is Daniel Fuller. I was Sergeant Fuller then, and the man who wrote most of what follows was 20 years younger in ways you can't wish back. I don't like telling the story. I have nightmares that start in the same place. A river, the sound of breath over water, Rico whimpering at my boots, and I wake up sweating and certain I haven't been given enough information to sleep again. But when those files surfaced, leaked in the wake of a desert power failure, as impossibly mundane an event as the snapping of a fuse, I felt a responsibility breathed down my neck. If the archive will not speak, someone must. If you work on rivers, patrol borderlands, or have documentary material that could add context to what I'm about to read aloud, there's a secure way to submit tips and files linked below. Be cautious. Respect whatever rules you need to follow where you live. But if something like this ever happened to you, you deserve to have it heard by someone who will not tidy it away with black ink. The night in question was not supposed to be anything more than routine. We were Jaguar 6, small footprint patrol, 2 Honduran squads, American advisory attached. Our mission that month was perimeter control along a known smuggling corridor that crossed into dense riverine forest. It was 1994 when we walked into it. The maps were thin, the route poorly maintained, and the river, Rio Coco, as it shows in our report, ran like a seam through the world, sometimes broad and lazy, sometimes choked and narrow. We were traveling light. 2 mule strings, 3 crew-served Wefsacks for the Honduran medic and an extra fuel jerry, and Rico, my dog, a German shepherd with more sense than most of us. Lieutenant Ortega led the patrol. Corporal Ethan Anderson carried the PRC-77 on his back and a cigarette he didn't smoke.
The Honduran soldiers, Ramirez, Gutierrez, Soto, moved like men who knew every unattractive inch of the brush. We made a camp near a bend where a backwater pooled. That stretch smelled of mud and rot and the thin whisper of damp leaves. Mosquitoes made a smell you could almost see. Night fell, and we did what soldiers do. We took turns keeping watch, ate cold rice, checked weapons, kept our eyes on the dark that lay somewhere beyond the orange cone of the lantern. The river spoke to itself in a language of slaps and insects. Everything looked like any other night. It is the small things that start wrong, not the big ones. The first wrong thing was Rico's ears. He froze at my side, hackles up. The dog isn't vocal unless he means to be. He turned toward the water and started to whine, a sound not of fear but of urgent attention. I remember thinking then that Rico had found a trail or heard some night animal that deserved to be watched, and I stood and peered into the black. Then, the breathing began. At first, it was a mistake I made. I thought someone was clearing their throat. It wasn't a throat. It came from the river like a fog being exhaled, slow, wet, a low, resonant inhalation followed by a long, rasping release. It wasn't wind. It wasn't man. It had a rhythm you could count on. 1, 2. Longer pause. 1, 2. And the air filled with it as if the river itself inhaled. The sound sat in the water and on the banks, and somehow in your chest. Ethan swore under his breath and thumbed the PRC-77. The device is old-schooled, heavy, and honest. It picks up a lot of static, but gives you a solid link to whatever frequencies you need. He curled the antenna like a man trying to coax a tune from an instrument. We are not alone, Ortega said, and what he meant was practical. We weren't alone, and presence in that country means risk. That was the change. The lightness of the night turned heavy. You can feel it like an extra layer of gravity pressing on your shoulders. We moved closer to the water. Ramirez went ahead with a hatchet, the kind of dull tool 100 hands have made sharp with practice. The bank was soft, earthen steps hidden under leaf litter. We found tracks. They started as deep impressions along the mud, a large three-lobed pattern, longer than a man's foot, but not quite human. The mud had been pushed aside in a way that suggested webbing, like the pad between a frog and the webbing of a duck, only larger and with a clearest outline of a long central claw that had dragged. There were scuff marks in the arcs like someone had pushed at the bank with broad shoulders. The impression ran in both directions, to the water and from it, as if something had come out and returned, or patrolled the edge. We took photos. Ethan had a small camera, and in the report he later filed, the one that would be half redacted, there are low-resolution images of the tracks, the print measurements scribbled, the mud sample bagged.
We cast one of the prints with plaster. The recovery team in daylight would find that cast unhelpful. It weighed heavy in our hands then, like a promise. If you have ever been close to wild animals, you will know they behave in ways that are both predictable and not. The tracks were the predictable bit. The rest was not. The mules began to bray in a way that made my teeth ache. One of the mules, thin, stubborn, and aching, would not stand still. The animal had always been skittish, but now he began to tug as if some invisible hand had taken his tether and shook him. He leaned toward the brush and then bolted, knocking into another mule. The night filled with the slap of canvas and the rattle of gear. Then, from the water itself, something moved. It didn't crest like a fish or break like a wave. It rose like a boulder yawning, a mass that pushed the water down and out. When it came into the moonlight, whatever it was had a skin like wet scales that picked up the lantern glare and ran it along ribs and shoulders. It was broad as a small truck's hood and elongated, like a head that was also a prow. Two lights, eyes, sat high on a face that looked set to survey the bank. The eyes were not animal in the conventional way. They took you in, scanned you, and then seemed to settle on Rico. Rico was frozen. He had been trained to stand down, but his body tensed to pull. He let out a sound like an animal that knows it's outmatched. That sound was the last civil thing of the night. The creature moved with a speed that made the world tilt. It slapped the water with a forelimb that looked like an arm, and the sound of the water hitting the bank is the memory I carry like residue, a boom that felt like a gunshot in the chest. The second the water moved, the mule went, literally in the space between breaths. The rope that tethered it went slack and then tugged, and the animal cried in a high, brief way and vanished as if the water had opened its throat and taken the mule in. There was no splash in the way you'd imagine, no long thrashing, just a void in the water and the sound of gurgle and something like an exhalation that matched the breathing we had heard before. Ethan shouted, "Corporal down," not meaning a man, but meaning the mule. Ortega was on him, hatchet flashing, but you can't hack through a river. Our radios, Ethan's PRC-77, the Honduran shortwave, started to flutter then die. At first it was a wet hiss under the breathing sound, then something odd. The static shaped into a low, rasping chorus that matched the rhythm of whatever breathed in the water. It sounded as if the river spoke back through the radio, the carrier wave modulated in a way that made human speech nonsense and animal breath synonymous. The sound overlaid every frequency we had. For a second I thought the batteries had gone out. They had not. We checked them later. The signal had been drowned. We retreated. There's a way soldiers move when they decide a place is compromised. You do not run, not in the rush of disorder. You break contact and move with purpose to the route that takes you to the nearest safety. We grabbed what we could. The lead mule string was gone. Rico yelped once and then was gone too. He followed the same path in the dark that the mule had taken. We lost gear. We lost pieces of ourselves in the river that night, and what we found in the shallows the next morning was not comforting. By the time we hit the road back to the forward operating base, one of us had vomited, and another had lost his temper in a way that made men suddenly very quiet. The breath sound hovered in the back of my skull like a second heartbeat. Ethan's face was small and white under the moon. He kept touching the side of his head where the radio had been strapped. We arrived at the FOB before dawn. The base had a generator and hot coffee, and a lieutenant who did the thing lieutenants do. Counted heads, asked what happened, wrote it down in the sort of neat hand that likes order. Lieutenant Marks is an American advisor who was a study in calm. He paced with a cigarette and then put it out. Captain Rodriguez from the Honduran side met us with lines tight on his face. We were lucky in a sense. No men lost, only animals and equipment. That would simplify the military accounting. But the rawness in our group made abstraction impossible. The first debrief was a businesslike attempt to return things to military grammar. Ortega gave a field report. Movement, contact, equipment loss. Named times and bearings.
He used the language that keeps chaos manageable. Ramirez and Sato kept their eyes down. Ethan put his hand on the plaster cast of the track and said we needed to bag and send it to whoever does analysis. The bandage on the mule's bridle had a smear of mud that did not look like anything we recognized. Afterwards, when they folded their pens, a small woman in a heavy jacket, apparently an intelligence tech, came in with a form. Incident reported as unknown aquatic predator and loss of pack animals and equipment, she read. That label, unknown aquatic predator, has stuck in official files as if it were a tidy answer. But the words were less a diagnosis than a polite shrug. The file we later found tucked in a vault was more thorough in places and professionally evasive in others. There were sketches in it that mapped the break in our line, notes on radio frequencies, and an annotation that read, in block letters, Red Zone. Red Zone, in military parlance, becomes a shorthand for do not tread. It closes off a place with paper and ink like a spell. Once labeled Red Zone, the place becomes more expensive to study, and the threshold for authorized attention rises. Somewhere between the first debrief and the paperwork, someone sat down and decided the story was more manageable if it had an official name and a visual marker.
It made the story do less damage to the ledger. We were told not to speak of it, for our safety and because of the operational risk. Mr. Crane from the Department of Defense Special Projects Division would conduct an interview later in the week, we were told. The way Lieutenant Marks said it made the promise of a later interview sound like a comforting box that would contain our recollections. It was not comforting. Mr. Crane's name appears in the recovered files, formal, quietly insistent. The record shows a short meeting and an unambiguous tone. We appreciate your cooperation. Remember classification. That language, classification, means several things. It means that an account has value, and the state will mug the value for itself. It means you cannot tell the butcher's tales you told over a beer without the risk that someone will step in and mark the sentences in ways you don't prefer. It is power exercised quietly. It is bureaucratic closure. We learned that evening that even when there's no body to bury, institutions can still bury a story. At first light, a recovery team went back to the bend. They combed the bank and the shallows and hauled up empty water churned with mud. They found the tack, the mule's bridle, and a single boot in a stand of reeds. No sign of blood, but a rubbed-away seam where leather and plant had been in friction. The plaster cast we left was intact, but showed little beyond the depth of a print. A note in the recovery log read, "No creature recovered. Evidence limited to impressions. Further study recommended." The word recommended in a military file is a place where enthusiasm goes to be politely extinguished. There were photos taken that morning. I do not own them. In the file that surfaced because the desert went dark, a series of low-resolution shots show the river's sheen and a hand pointing to a disturbed tangle of branches. The caption is clinical. The images themselves, grainy and small, are of the kind that instruction manuals use to indicate a problem without offering a solution. Then the things we did not expect happened. The radios in the FOB recorded interference that the intelligence people described as intermittent carrier modulation that matched the breathing pattern we had heard. The lab wrote a memo that such modulation could be atmospheric or equipment-related, but they could not recreate it in testing with the same gear. A separate analyst annotated, anomalous acoustic signature. An analyst's annotation is an invitation to other analysts to either confirm or confound. Many analysts lean toward confounding, better for the ledger. Meanwhile, the men who had stared into the water that night went on with lives that unwound slowly. Ramirez took to drinking on the off hours until a domestic transfer moved him closer to family. Soto made a point of doing long road patrols after that. Moving ground keeps you from thinking about water things. Ethan kept reading.
He sat on crates and went through old journals and naval logs and local anecdotes. He had an appetite for connecting dots, and that appetite would become an obsession years later. For now, he sat quiet, fingers stained with mud from the plaster cast. Rico was gone. I sat with the ache of that absence, the way you sit with another man's grief. It is private, but shares space with you. My official statement, what I wrote down in the debrief, was short and direct. That was the efficient, trained version of my memory. The files recovered in the desert include two versions of events, the field report and a more candid typed interview that I gave the week after to a woman with a neutral tone and a stack of forms. That second document is peppered with redactions, names blacked out, phrases scratched away. That redacted interview is the one that sat dormant for 2 decades until the power in the desert failed and the casing came loose. Reading my own words with my face older than when I wrote them is an odd violence. The report reads like someone trying to be useful to a chain of command that favors tidy conclusions. Unknown aquatic predator, the report says. Loss of pack animals, gear, no human casualties. Zone marked for restricted access pending analysis. Those are the formalities. There are other things the report allowed itself to keep: the cast, the radio file, the mention of the breathing present on the magnetic tape of the PRC-77 logs. The logs are small, but they exist as waveforms. The archive labeled them as audio interference, and small notes state that whatever produced these waveforms left no clear biological signature. In the days after, there were visits to our sleeping areas by men who introduced themselves with the careful smile of people who carry authority without bluster. "We appreciate discretion," one said. "There are hazards to loose talk in this theater." I remember thinking then that the hazard they were guarding us from might be the discomfort of people in power knowing too much. There was never a direct threat. There was a steady tightening of options. Requests to sign non-disclosure forms, quiet suggestions that if we needed help, we should go through official channels. Official channels make sorrow heavier and longer. After the formalities, life tried to reassert itself in mundane ways. The jungle keeps growing in the places you leave it, and the river returned to its business as if it had not swallowed a mule. The day we walked the bank for a second time, the mud had already erased the clearest marks. Water smooths things out like an indifferent hand. That fact haunted me. Nature is patient and will cover what it chooses. It wasn't just the river that covered things. Files and forms and the choice to declare a thing a red zone were equally adapted concealment. Ethan, who would later become a researcher obsessed with relations between folklore and incident reports, took to compiling a chronology.
He mailed FOIA requests from an email that looked like a draft of an experiment in patience. He lined up interviews with a Brazilian biologist who had found tracks by a tributary in a different year, and a Panamanian park ranger who had his own half-remembered night of radio interference. The patterns Ethan began to put together were not proof, but they were a pattern: rivers, interference, packs lost, large prints, and a tendency in institutional responses toward quiet containment. Men with authority painted over the edges of the problem instead of giving it light. That pattern is what has always worried me more than the thing in the water. People have reasons to hide things: security, money, embarrassment. But patterns are not conspiracies. They're evidence that similar responses occur in many places. The documents recovered when the desert went dark show redacted memos from different sectors with similar language: operational sensitivity, classification recommended, minimize public dissemination. They were consistent and not necessarily malicious, the kind of bureaucratic muscle memory that closes ranks when something does not fit a tidy file. We were ordered to do nothing that would attract attention. Our commander wrote in a note that was later turned into an extract that safe-housed most things behind code words: ensure minimal dissemination, protect local population, provide limited support to salvaging operations only. In other words, document, avoid publicity, and do not invite independent scrutiny. I remember sitting in the mess tent that week and feeling the air leave the room in a single continuous exhale. We eat with our hands sometimes in jungle operations, cutting dried meat and stale bread, and trying to make warmth from the small comforts left to us. The rest of the base moved on. Helicopters came and left. The laundry still flapped on a line. That momentum makes quietness easy to isolate. The world will go on, and it will do so with or without your memory as a piece of it. Months later, Ethan would go on to file FOIA requests, hand copy memos, and correspond with others who kept notes. He saved copies of what he was allowed to take. He typed his findings in long, narrow fonts late into the night. He presented them at a small symposium in Savannah, where a handful of people nodded with the polite skepticism of people who make careers for proof. They called the pattern anomalous riveric events in conference slides so that press releases could avoid the messy word creature. Language is a way to dress the unknown in acceptable clothes. I did not know then that Ethan's work would be partially lost, that his emails would be ignored by journals, and his slides would be met with a professional shrug. I only knew we had been there, we had seen something, and then the institutional machinery closed. That is not to say there was malice. More often it is risk aversion dressed as policy.
It is much easier to lock a file away than to dig into the consequences of what you might find. There are things I will not claim. I will not tell you we recovered a body. We didn't. I will not tell you we found DNA and ran tests. We did not. All I can offer is testimony, records of what we observed, and the small artifacts that were left in a binder that no one could keep perfectly closed. I will not suggest motives for why an intelligence office decided to mark a zone red. I will say it made further work costly and rare. The first part of this account ends where the paper trail begins to thicken with an institutional hand. The recovery team had returned an inventory with boxes, plaster cast, photo set 1 through 5, radio log tapes, an audio file labeled anomalous carrier modulation, and a typed interview with my name on it. The boxes traveled up a chain of custody beyond our sight. Somewhere between base and archive, the story lost pieces to redaction. Somewhere in that chain, someone, maybe for prudence, maybe for policy, decided this story was not to be aired openly. I signed the papers they put before me, because a signature tightens a knot in the rope around your mouth. We were promised a thorough internal review. We were promised support for men affected. We were promised nothing in particular, which is sometimes the most secure promise of all. In later years, long after the river had intended to forget us, I would sit in a motel with a printout of those files and a cheap cigarette and think about the generator that failed in the desert. It seemed so ordinary an event to be the cause of a disclosure, so minor a human error to be the hinge that opened a vault. When I read through the folder the leak produced, I found the field report, the recovery log, a brittle photocopy of the radio waveform, and a single annotated page from an intelligence analyst that said simply, "Do not release to press. Additional context required." The additional context never arrived. There are more pieces to this story, and I have had to learn, over the many quiet years since, how to tell them without collapsing into legend. The night at Rio Coco is one thread. The redacted memos and the desert failure are another. There are other threads: Ethan's later database of incidents, the other eyewitness statements from across the continent, the small conference rooms where slides are shown and eyes flick past and away. There are people not yet named in these pages who will matter. There are places where the record goes cold or becomes a smear of black ink. When the power went out in that desert archive and the binder tumbled open, I felt for the first time in a long time the possibility that the things we'd seen might be read in a light that didn't immediately choose lockboxes and secrecy. The leak is messy, not heroic. It doesn't prove anything by itself, but it opens the possibility of conversation beyond the limits someone else drew for us.
I will tell you the patrol as it happened, exactly as I remember it. The sound, the smell, the wet shine of scales in the moonlight. I will show you what the recovery teams wrote down, and where their words stop. I will show you how the administrative arm took the rawness of our experience and flattened it into a file. What I will not do is give you certainty where the record doesn't permit it. We did not retrieve a corpse. We did not pull back a curtain and find a man's explanation waiting on the other side. We walked away with plaster, tape, and a memory that didn't want to let us be spared. We were told repeatedly to let the file be handled by channels. We were given the vocabulary of secrecy, classified, restricted access, operational sensitivity. Those words are how institutions keep a scar from being picked at in public. They are the velvet gloves on a hand that closes. The binder that tumbled during that desert power failure had sat under those gloves and was dusty from neglect. When it opened, it spilled not the body of a creature, but the outlines of a story that could no longer be smoothed over with a single stamp. There is more to read. There are audio files, memos, redactions, and other patrol logs that echo ours. There are accounts from local people whose names rarely make the official record, but whose lives are most affected by the things that live in and around the rivers. There are patterns Ethan tried to map and could not, and there is a question as old as the first explorer's journal. What do you do when you know something the ledger prefers not to hold? The answer is rarely neat. I close this section with the image of the plaster cast in my hands at dawn, gray, still wet, the shape of a print that is both familiar and alien. It was the first physical thing we had to hold that contradicted the tidy wording of supply loss and equipment failure. It did not prove much by itself, but when the desert next whispered and a file came back into view, that cast was among the few physical traces left to testify. The plaster dried in my hands, and then it didn't. Time does funny things in memory. Sometimes objects harden only to remain pliant inside the parts of you that haven't learned to let go. We photographed the cast, notarized the kit's chain of custody in stodgy little ink, and handed the box up the ladder of command. That box left our tent, and the sound of the water stayed, like a radio station you can't quite turn off. What happened to that box matters because of how the military makes things disappear without drums and cloaks. The boxes went to supply. Supply sent them to intelligence. Intelligence sent them to a regional archive, and the regional archive shipped a crate to a facility for preservation, language that reads like care on paper and like silencing in practice.
Somewhere along the way, pages gained black marks. Names disappeared under the comfort of a thick marker.
Annotations were made in pencil and then crossed out in ink. That is the mundane choreography of classification. Nothing dramatic, just a slow accretion of opacity. Months later, I met Mr. Crane. He had a voice that never quite showed emotion, like someone who'd learned to keep his face out of the room. The interview with him is in the files recovered after the desert failure. It's one of the things that fell open when the lights went out. He asked polite questions and then offered policies. He said, in the clipped way men with rank do, "We have to protect both operational security and public confidence. Your reports will be handled accordingly." He didn't argue with what we reported. He didn't need to. He offered classification as a solution. "Control the narrative," he said once. Not in those words exactly, but in the soft bureaucratic version of them. Limit dissemination. There are moments where you realize you're not being cared for, you're being managed. That difference matters. Management is not benevolence. It is a decision structure that calculates risk and exposure and then applies a blanket where the wound should be treated. Mr. Crane's division annotated the materials they received. Operational sensitivity, read one stamp. Redaction required, read a second. In an internal note, marked leak risk low but still stamped, someone scrawled a short sentence in the margin. Pattern noted. Recommend interagency deconfliction. Interagency deconfliction meant that more people, including non-military hands, would be given access, more places to fold the story into common silent paper. Ethan, always the dogged one, refused to let the boxes go without leaving a footprint. I remember him at a table in the mess, late and cigarette-ended, copying out the memos that he was allowed to photocopy and typing in the redacted words as brackets, like a man trying to fill in a crossword puzzle with missing clues. He learned to read the spaces left by black ink as if they were letters. Where the file had a blot that said redacted, Ethan wrote possible meanings in the margins. He did not do this for drama. He did it because the pattern he saw demanded more canvases to connect. He filed FOIA requests the way some men file appeals in the middle of an argument they cannot yet win. He requested logs, audio tapes, disposition notes, and any interagency communications referencing anomalous riveric events or unknown aquatic predator. A lot of his requests came back with the same posture: redactions, a posture of refusal couched in law, paragraphs excised because of ongoing operations or privacy concerns. That phrase, ongoing operations, is useful when time can be stretched like taffy. If a file is related to operations, it can be rolled forward indefinitely by the comfortable assumption that something else is always happening. What Ethan assembled over years of patience and bad coffee was less a proof than a topology of oddities. It became a map.
The map did not name dates so much as places: a backwater of the Napo, a blackened oxbow in an unnamed basin, a chain of bridges where fishermen swore up and down a stretch of river had emptied overnight sometime in an earlier decade, radio operators who remembered hearing breathing on the carrier wave. Ethan's notes linked our Rio Coco night to a handful of other nights where packs disappeared, animals vanished, and crucially, where electronics, then and now, behaved as if another transmitter had been co-opted. One of his earliest finds was a scribbled ranger report from the Napo, purportedly filed by a Brazilian biologist who worked with indigenous communities. It was basic, the kind of document that sits in a drawer until someone reads it for pattern instead of evidence. It said, plain and small, that 2 trap lines had been cleaned out overnight without tracks typical of jaguars or tapirs. There were prints, the biologist reported, but they were wrong. 3-lobed marks set in a mud so slow it clung to boots. When Ethan called the biologist, the man spoke the way people in small towns do when their lives are threaded with stories no journal seems to want, quietly, in fragments that sounded like apologies. He had photos, he said in the phone interview, that Ethan recorded and later archived in a folder we labeled Napo, Witness. The photos, grainy and weathered, were not proof. They were artifacts, blurry shapes, impressions, a hand with a ruler. The local people, the biologist told us, had names for river things that did not fit Western taxonomies. He did not claim monsters. He claimed unclassifiable behavior. In Peru, Ethan found a park ranger memo describing an incident near a sluice where a boat's motor would not start despite fuel in reserve. The crew swore the starter turned, and then nothing, a hollow click and silence. They later reported an odor, like damp iron and algae, and the next morning a pack of dogs were missing, along with a cooler full of fish.
The memo concluded with a line that read like a bad punchline: "No human casualties, local response recommended." The memo was stamped, examined, and then placed in a tile of other curiosities. In Panama, the ranger who'd had radio interference in his log wrote to a friend who worked for a conservation NGO. "We heard the breathing under the band at night," his letter read. "It sounded like air pulling through a throat, and our transmissions fell through it as if the river accepted them and kept them." Those are the kinds of sentences that sound like myth to statisticians and like a beating heart to people who have heard the air move in a way your training cannot file. These were the things Ethan collected and stitched together into a presentation he named, for lack of a better term, Anomalous Riveric Events.
He mapped clusters, not like a proof but like a weather chart. Clumps around the Amazon basin, another cluster skirting Central America's waterways, isolated not because the phenomenon was rare, but because the places most affected were places that keep their own counsel. He drew lines between reports, where radio logs showed carrier modulation that, when slowed and played back, matched the inhalation-exhalation rhythm we had heard on Rio Coco. He called up samples and played them at a small conference in Savannah, where we stood in a corner of a room full of conference chairs and a scatter of gray heads. Savannah was small enough to be intimate and large enough to be broken. The hall smelled of coffee and conference carpet. Ethan's slides were plain. He made no spectacle of them. He showed maps and translations of redacted memos, put up grainy photos and the plaster cast measurements, and played an audio clip from one PRC-77 log that, at low volume, you could mistake for a ship in fog. He did not claim the creature had hands or reverence or political intent. He showed patterns and asked questions. Most people in the room were practiced skeptics. A herpetologist took the microphone and said, helpfully, large crocodilians and caimans can account for unusual prints if their paws slide, and flood dynamics can explain disappearance of small animals. He was not unkind. He had seen things and had a reasonable set of propositions. The scientists in the room nodded. A folklorist from a small university stood and explained how local linguistic frames can convert animal behavior into something that reads supernatural to outsiders. She cataloged stories of river guardians from indigenous cosmologies and warned against flattening myth into mere error. Those were valid cautions. Then a British filmmaker, call him unnamed in the recovered emails but present in Ethan's correspondence, piped up with the practical edge of someone who had tried to sell a story and found the market shivery. "We have footage," he said. "It's not definitive, it's not pretty, but it's footage." He had tried to include it in a documentary pitch and been told it wasn't a fit for audiences who want tidy ends. He told the room about attempts to secure distribution and the polite rejections that sounded like fear dressed as taste. What the room couldn't do was make the interference go away. Radio engineers suggested atmospheric ducting could do odd things. A retired signal analyst, someone who had tracked communications for Home Command in a long military life, stood up and said in an aside, "If multiple independent operators report the same carrier anomalies, you don't dismiss it out of hand. You try to recreate the conditions. You look for commonality in equipment, frequency, and locale." That was a boring sentence with serious teeth hidden in it. Try to recreate the conditions.
No one had successfully recreated the breathing on a lab bench. Attempts to force the carrier to congeal into that pattern failed. The lab reports in our recovered files said as much. Anomalous acoustic signature cannot replicate with current equipment in controlled environment. They called it anomalous because, in the dry language of analysis, the alternative would be to call it impossible. Ethan left Savannah with two things: a small group of people who believed enough to keep talking, and the sense that institutions would not grant him the paperwork he sought. He kept writing, he kept compiling, he corresponded with a Brazilian biologist who agreed to send better photos, a Panamanian park ranger who scrawled additional notes, and a young British filmmaker who offered to digitize footage he had never landed on a network. These were not formal partnerships so much as a network pinned together by curiosity and, frankly, a refusal to let the subject vanish. The pattern, when you try to make it look like an argument, has a stubbornness that becomes its own witness. Rivers, particularly those that collect silt and braid and backwater, are places where things can lose definition. They are also places that people visit often: fishermen, rangers, smugglers, researchers. Thus, the set of observance is odd and distributed. The pattern Ethan generated was not neat, it was messy like the rivers themselves, but that messiness made the pattern more troubling. We were not a single outlier. Efforts to make that map public ran into a wall of indifference and a gate of policy. Journal editors asked for verifiable sources, peer reviewers wanted samples. The problem, stated in plain language, is the control of proof. Proof requires a body or DNA or a high-resolution image. We had prints, waveforms, stray photos, and testimony. That is not nothing. In scientific terms, it is preliminary evidence. In public terms, it is inconvenient. In institutional terms, it is a liability. There are other forces at play beyond the simple stubbornness of bureaucracy. The presence of classified language in memos has an effect on publication. A document stamped with classification becomes a cautionary tale. People who might press for more research get cold-shouldered with operational sensitivity. Organizations with funding to conduct fieldwork must satisfy donors. Donors, in turn, prefer research that yields publishable, citable results. It is easier to fund a study that promises measurable outcomes than one that wants to camp on the bank of an unknown river and wait. Funding flows where confidence rests. Ethan knew all of that and kept going anyway. He established a small repository on a private server, password protected and accessible only to those who could be vouched for. He cataloged the boxes we had, field report, recovery log, radio tapes, and filled them with additions, photocopies of memos, the correspondence from the British filmmaker, scans from the biologist.
He tried to arch two things at once, to protect the material and to make it impossible to say later that nothing existed. That server survived him for a while. He never meant it for broadcast. He meant it for memory. Years folded. People get older. Men who have seen the world in extremes find themselves surprised by small, domestic erosions. Ethan took a job as a consultant for a non-governmental research group. He spoke at small universities and kept the map alive. He also became a man whose voice, to me, sounded thin on the phone in the later years. He worried about losing files, and he wrote often about redundancy. He trusted paper, even if institutions did not. He told me once over cheap coffee in a strip mall diner that if we don't keep the files, who will? He said it without heroics, only with exhaustion. Then he died. I will not speculate on why. The medical notes I saw were private. He passed, and with him went much of what he'd been the only person to hold in a coherent way. Some backup files remained, copies he had sent to a handful of people and to a cloud service. Some emails were preserved by archivists and by journalists who believed in redundancy. But a lot of the work that had not been shared became lonely and unread in a hard drive that someone later claimed as inheritance. The loss of his presence was a grief we filed in our own private stacks. When filmmakers and journalists began showing interest, after the whisper of the Desert Files began to spread, people reached out to me. My first instinct was to say no. The things the Desert Leak had shown me were not the kind of thing you parade for cameras. They were a collection of small betrayals and institutional shames. But then I thought of Ethan, who used to sit on the floor in our tent and stitched the world together with photocopies. He would have wanted more than silence after his name went quiet. The binder that fell open in the desert is not a cinematic deus ex machina. It is mundane. A fuse, a failing generator, carelessness and maintenance. These are small nudges that let the light slip and allow a man to see what had been locked. The materials inside that binder were imperfect. There were 2 versions of my own statement and a set of tapes that had been copied and recopied like an old song. The tapes have hiss, they have interference. They do not have the clarity modern audiences crave. They do, however, possess the original carrier modulation. When slowed down and isolated by technicians, the waveform's peaks correspond to a breath-like pattern. That is a technical fact in a file marked Audio Examination Anomalous. I do not know what the waveform means beyond what we heard. I do not know if it is biological or mechanical, or a strange conjunction of ionospheric conditions and corroded electronics. The files themselves do not tell motives or taxonomy. They only register phenomena. The archival leak made those files available for people who wanted to study them.
It also made them available for people who wanted to close them with a stamp. Both outcomes are possible. After the binder leaked, I received calls I had not been expecting. Old soldiers, a Brazilian biologist, a Panamanian ranger, and even the British filmmaker. The biologist sent me clearer scans. The ranger sent audio. The filmmaker sent a low-resolution clip of ripples on a river with movement that could be anything. The calls were not dramatic. They were polite and weary. People who had been holding fragments felt briefly less alone. We convened. By convened, I mean we used email and encrypted messages. We met in parking lots and small motel rooms. We compared notes and tried to put a handle on what we were doing. No one claimed certainty. We simply asked for the freedom to keep asking questions. That freedom is fragile. In one of the memos recovered in the Desert Box, a senior analyst wrote, "Risk of public alarm versus benefit of disclosure. Weigh prudently." This is not nefarious language. It is a calculation. The analyst meant that if the public hears unknown predator, fishing communities might panic, economic disruption could ripple, and local governments might lose face. The analyst was not wrong.
Those are real consequences. Yet using those consequences as a reason to avoid research strikes me as possible arrogance. We assume the public cannot be trusted with ambiguity. We prefer to decide for them. There were other, quieter consequences to the silence. Rangers who report strange things found their jobs uncomfortable with the publicity. Their families were put under scrutiny. Men who had lost animals or livelihoods found no compensation because in official logs the incident had been framed as informational and not a material loss. The people who live on the banks bear the brunt of the quiet. That's a moral observation, not a political one. When institutions choose caution over curiosity, the most vulnerable are left with unanswered questions. Part of what Ethan wanted was not simply to publish a paper. It was to create a corridor of attention that meant the lights of research could come and not be immediately shut off by policy. He wanted field teams, cameras, independent labs on site. He wanted to try to replicate the conditions we experienced: radio logs, repeated sampling, thermal surveys, and community interviews. He knew that if you treat rivers like laboratories, they resist. Water moves, mud sloughs, animals shift. Fieldwork is repetitive and patient and boring in a way headlines are not. That kind of boring patience is what makes science possible. The money and the political will for it were lacking. The small network that arose after Savannah and after the Desert Leak tried to do what it could. A British filmmaker digitized old footage and made it available to a small consortium.
A Brazilian biologist wrote an internal paper about track morphology that he shared without seeking publication because he was not sure publication would keep his indigenous sources safe. A retired signal analyst gave the group time to re-examine the waveforms. A folklorist translated local names and cautioned us not to trivialize them. Together, they formed a collage rather than a conclusion. We did collect some physical traces that, when photographed and shared with a broader group, created a sort of communal catalog. There were mud patterns preserved on boards. There were plaster casts like the one I had held. There were low-resolution photos of swollen backs and ripples. None of it constituted a body. None of it yielded DNA that satisfied modern expectations. But together, they were not nothing. To the network, these scraps were a map of recurring phenomena. One of the filaments of truth that threads the whole thing is the radio. Radio is an old technology, but it is honest in ways new tech is not. It drags the environment into its signal chain. The PRC-77 is clumsy and heavy, a soldier's radio. It also records things. When an operator hears a weird carrier, it is something that can be revisited. The takes of those nights, warped and hissy, have been listened to by 3 independent signal analysts, 2 of whom report non-standard modulation corresponding to breath-like envelope. That is careful language. It does not mean life. It means a pattern. My interpretation is withheld not because I lack convictions, but because vivid conviction requires evidence. Evidence is what we do not have enough of. So we did what survivors often do. We told the story in ways we could. Ethan presented what he had. I contributed my statement. The British filmmaker compiled footage and interviewed local witnesses whose words, when translated, gave texture to the files. The Desert Binder had shown me that what is filed away can be resurrected into conversation if someone opens the drawer. It also taught me that few people will voluntarily open that drawer. You need a small coincidence, a power failure, oftentimes to reveal how fragile the seals of secrecy are. The desert power failure itself is an image I go back to when I try to explain why the story matters now. There is a human comedy in a generator failing in a place that everyone assumed safe. No villain required. The generator was old, maintenance gets deferred, someone flips a breaker the wrong way. The precaution that kept things in one place is undone by the same entropy that unthreads every plan. That is not a moral, it is a pattern of the world. When the drawer came open, the files inside were, in raw terms, a set of memos. The kinds of memos that populate the pages I have shown you are the organizational equivalents of a man's scabbed wounds, tidy, yellowed, informative in their omissions. A redacted memo might read, "Redacted, reported interference during night operations." Field team recovered plaster cast and audio logs. Recommend restricted access. Another note, perhaps less redacted, might read, "Interagency consult recommended given spatial pattern of incidents." Those little administrative twitches are the needle marks that show something was touched. What I find most human when I read those memos with the hands the world has given me is how often they slide into the vocabulary of risk management. Minimize dissemination, reads one. Protect local population, reads another. Continue to monitor. That is faintly compassionate language. It is also a mechanism to keep curiosity on a leash. The effect is that people like me, witnesses whose testimonies are the raw material of study, are politely asked to sit down. Their experiences are placed in boxes with care instructions. There is also a quieter thread of responsibility that does not show up in memos.
It lives in the way men lean into each other's moments at the tail end of a patrol and talk, badly and with humor, to keep the memory from boiling. It lives in nightly rituals of putting hands on packs and remembering the dog's fur and the mule's bridle. That memory is a matter of conscience. We are, some of us, compelled by loyalty to the absent to make noise. The noise I have chosen to make is calibrated. I will not claim ultimate answers. I will not embroider with fiction. I will present what the archive, opened by an ordinary desert failure, allowed me to see. The binder is partial. It is not the whole story. It also contains evidence of treatment, marks of redaction, notes recommending restricted dissemination, and a list of other incidents that point toward a regional pattern of anomalous events. I want to read an excerpt from one of those recovered memos. It is short and clinical. The language is the language of men who are not inclined to dramatize. It reads, Subject, Incident, Rio Coco Control. Summary. Jaguar 6 field report indicates loss of pack animals and anomalous audio interference consistent with prior regional reports. Evidence. Plaster cast, item 3A. Photo set, items 4 through 8. Radio log tapes, items 9 through 11. Action. Designate as restricted. Consider interagency brief. Public release, not recommended at this stage. There is a dry bureaucratic logic to that paragraph. It is not a confession or a denial. It is an inventory followed by a suggestion to avoid release. It's the kind of phrasing that neutralizes urgency by reclassing it as a procedural task. That is why the binder mattered. It showed the human decisions behind the nice, neutral words. The decision to keep the narrative restricted had consequences. Researchers who sought to study the area were blocked by access protocols. Journalistic inquiries were deflected by operational sensitivity. Local communities were not engaged in robust ways because of risk to public safety. Those are real trade-offs and not always wrong in motive.
But when trade-offs become default, stories are suspended in a bureaucratic purgatory. So what are we left with? We have the river in my memory. We have plaster and photos and hissing waveforms. We have a small network of researchers, filmmakers, biologists, and retired technicians who have kept the files alive in private servers in small archives. We have an archive that was opened, however accidentally, by a desert power failure. We have people who have lost animals and livelihoods, and perhaps a sense of safety. We have an institutional response that focuses on containment and classification more than inquiry. We also have a question that sits at the center of this whole uncomfortable project. When something resists tidy classification, what should an institution do? Lock it, study it more, open it to public scrutiny? The answer is not obvious. Each option has costs. Let me tell you about one more document from the recovered files, something that reads like an accident report, but is really a ledger of inference. It is written by an analyst whose handwriting is careful. It is stamped internal. It says, in essence, multiple incidents of unknown aquatic predator do not constitute biological proof. However, repeated carrier anomalies and recurring three-lobed prints in muddy substrates warrant a targeted environmental study. Recommend allocation of resources for a limited deployable team capable of long-term observation and sample collection. That memo ends with a line that reads, funding and political risk must be assessed. That last line is the hinge. There was a decision not to fund a long-term study. It was not a malicious choice. It was a budgetary and political calculus. Someone with a spreadsheet decided that the return on investment for a patient expensive field study, one that could take years and might yield no certainties, was too low. In a world of finite attention, we must choose what to study. The choice, in this case, favored other priorities. Years after the binder fell open, the documentary world and the press world took a tentative interest. A major outlet asked me for an interview, and then cooled off when legal counsel suggested risk. A small journal published Ethan's preliminary map, and then took it down after a complaint about sourcing. These are not dramatic things. They are the banal ways stories die. They die behind redaction and behind the practicalities of publication. The desert failure gave me the chance to keep the story moving. It did not guarantee a mass reckoning. There is also an ethical element I cannot ignore. The rivers are home to people whose livelihoods depend on the water. A sensational piece can hurt them. If I were to scream monster into headlines without care, I might cause more harm than good. That restraint is part of why my voice is measured in these pages.
I have the duty not only to speak, but to speak in ways that do not endanger those whose lives are intertwined with the rivers we study. So what is the practical path forward? I cannot offer a solution that looks like a neat scientific breakthrough. There is a more modest, more laborious course. Encourage and fund targeted fieldwork. Recruit independent signal analysts to recreate the carrier conditions. Work with local communities to collect oral histories and observational logs. Train and fund rangers and researchers to maintain systematic data collection. And, importantly, create redundancy for physical records so that the data cannot be made to disappear by a single administrative stroke. Those are the things Ethan asked for in his quieter moments: patience, money, and care.
I am old enough now to see the moral texture of survival in a clearer way. It is not merely the case that systems hide, it is also the case that people who see things and speak about them pay costs. Men like Ramirez and Sato adjusted their patrols. Men like Ortega carried the memory like a stone in a pocket. Men like Ethan burned themselves out with FOIA requests until his body no longer kept pace with his zeal. I feel the toll in the small, private ways men change. A pause in laughter. A hand that trembles when it thinks of water. A late-night call to a friend asking, "Do you ever hear it again?" The Desert Binder gave me permission, of a sort, to put this story down in public. Permission is the wrong word. It was more like an opportunity. A mundane failure allowed a document to press itself into the light. The consequences of that leak are mixed. Some files were copied and shared. Others were seized back into the dark. The archive administrators told people the leak was being investigated and that no public release would be sanctioned. That was unsurprising and not without procedural justification. It was also, to me, a reminder that archives are only as honest as the people who tend them. I want to close with two small scenes. The first is a scene of fieldwork that never happened because it was never funded. In my head, it goes like this: a team of 5, financed for a season, thermal imagers on tripods along a crooked bank, long wave recorders and a station for radio recordings, a biologist waiting with sample jars, a translator sitting with an elder from the riverside village who tells stories about a thing in the water that people once placated with offerings. The team returns each week with data and dust, and slowly accumulates the pieces a pattern needs to become a narrative that is less spectral and more consumable by science. It is not dramatic. It is slow. It is the thing I wish we had been able to do. The second scene is the desert room in the aftermath of the outage. The shelves are half empty, the emergency lights are off, and someone has finally dared to pull a case from the back. A binder spills open. Photocopies scatter.
A technician, tired, reads a memo and frowns. He does not know the lives the memo hides. He only knows his job is now to reconcile the paperwork with policy. That man will mark pages and call superiors. The page will be read, and then another decision will be made. It is not a climax. It is an administrative life. It is also the place where our lives meet the ledger. I have told this story because I owe it to the animals we lost, Rico and the mule, and to men like Ethan who kept a map in a world that prefers tidy answers. I have told it because the binder, opened by a small accidental failure, allowed me to see how stories can be not so much buried as lovingly filed away in ways that make them feel forgotten. I have told it because rivers hold histories, and because sometimes keeping a thing secret does not make it safer, it only makes it lonelier. If you have information, photographs, tapes, or first-hand accounts about incidents like this, there are secure ways to share them. There is a repository and a process compiled by independent researchers linked below. They are not a government mouthpiece, and they will respect local laws and privacy. I would ask that if you choose to submit, do so with caution and thought for the people whose livelihoods depend on the places we study. There are no tidy conclusions here. There are instead small, persistent acts of testimony. The desert failure made a binder fall open. That binder is imperfect but important. It shows that institutional decisions can, with mundane choices, either shelter or smother questions. It shows that pattern, not singular proof, may be the most honest thing we have. And it shows me, now gray and tired, that the obligations of a witness don't expire because time passes. We are left with questions that will not be answered in the space of an afternoon. How many things are kept in climate-controlled silence? How many of those things are artifacts of inertia? And how many are things that would change how we think about the rivers we depend upon? I do not know. I will say only this. If you work on a river and you hear the air move like a breath, take note. If a radio carrier hums in a way that suggests a throat, record it if you safely can. If you find odd prints, cast them carefully and photograph everything. Redundancy is not paranoia when the ledger can choose erasure. It is simple insurance. Protect your data. Share it cautiously with people you can trust. Preserve the small rituals of evidence that men in distant offices will need if we are ever to treat these patterns as worthy of patient attention. Finally, I will return to the image that has followed me for 2 decades, morning on the bank after the mule vanished, the plaster in my hands, the river moving as if nothing had happened. The world proceeds with a thin indifference. Our job is to decide how loudly we will remember. I have chosen to speak. Ethan chose to keep a map.
Ramirez and the others chose new patrols and different roads. We all did what we could. If you'd like to read the declassified appendices and the copies of the memos that were recovered after the Desert Power failure, follow the link below to download the dossier the independent researchers have prepared. If you have footage or files, there is guidance there on how to submit them securely. I ask, finally, that you carry this story with restraint and care. It is not entertainment. It is, for some of us, a record of loss and a plea for patience. How many things remain buried, both in the boxes on quiet shelves and in the bends of rivers that forget? I do not know. I only know that when a light goes out and a binder falls open, someone must be there to read what spills out. I will keep reading, for as long as I am able.